Hello and welcome back. I'm Dan, the Neuro Man, and this is where we change the system. Nice to have you with me again, folks. So, this week we have episode 7, the social energy problem. So, that is what we're going to talk about today, social energy, and why social interaction can feel exhausting. So, for some people, social interaction is energizing. For others, particularly neurodivergent people, it is extremely draining. And that's not because we don't enjoy it, but because of the effort involved. If we peel back the layers of a conversation, or be it the concept of a conversation, it involves several things. It involves listening, it involves processing, it involves reading cues, social cues, and responding to those social cues. Now, for neurodivergent people like myself, this can be very challenging, even more so when we don't read people very well, or the atmosphere in the room, for example. Now, for neurotypical people, this is automatic. They just pick it up at the drop of a hat. There's no problem there at all. They have a natural way of initiating conversation, keeping it flowing, keeping it interesting, making it relevant. But for neurodivergent people, it's very active. And that takes an awful lot of energy, folks. Sometimes conversations feel like multitasking. Now, as a neurodivergent person with autism and ADHD, some of the things I struggle with conversation is when someone asks me multiple questions all at once. You know, I'd rather them ask me the first question than allow me time to process, to read the cues, and then to respond to that question. And this was something that I struggled greatly with in school because it was always a challenge during the exam process. And because I didn't have my ADHD or autism diagnosis at that time, I was not entitled to any reasonable adjustments. So that's things like a scribe or extra time. And I can remember my LSA saying to me, you know, we were having a conversation about the possibility of me working in a separate room to everybody else because I said, I do feel that that would aid in my concentration. And the words that she uttered to me were, "You will be treated like any other pupil in the school." Now, I know that she had no control over that. That was the school's decision, be it the head's decision or the Senko. I don't know. So already I was starting to fall under the radar. My needs just weren't being acknowledged, even though it was acknowledged that I had needs, but educators did not know what category these needs belonged to. Okay, so he's got learning difficulties. He's got processing difficulties. He doesn't seem to understand the context of the questions that are asked of him. He daydreams an awful lot. He just needs to try harder. He needs to contribute more to class discussion. He needs to be more proactive in his answering of questions in class. And it wasn't because I didn't want to answer the questions, it was a combination of many things. It was confidence, it was trying to focus on what the teacher was saying whilst listening to the noises of other people's at the back of me or at the front of me or something outside. I just could not place my focus. Now, the whole concept of school lessons, 5 periods or 6 periods in some schools, that's a very long day for a neurodivergent person. And ultimately, looking back, there was a lot of tears, there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of heavy emotions. And I didn't realize that also it was a combination of hormones as well, going through my teenage years, that essentially it was burnout. Years of being misunderstood, years of being judged or ridiculed for having invisible disabilities that hadn't come to fruition yet. And like any other neurodivergent child, you would think that, okay, well, once I leave school, it'll get better. I'll work with people who understand me more. Um, just, there'll be less pressure and all that kind of thing. It turned out I was wrong about that. As soon as I left school, I went straight to college, did my BTEC in performing arts, and those challenges just followed me everywhere. So there were still those issues with social interaction. There was the issues of trying to fit in, and once I went into the workplace, it proved to be more of a challenge. And it was at a time where autism was still being officially recognized. And I think people still associate autism with people who are sensitive to noise, who make random noises, who are non-verbal, or who can speak but can't speak coherently. Same with ADHD. They associate it with people who can't sit still, who constantly call out, who can't focus. They're not seeing the layers underneath. I think there's better understanding of it now than there was back in, say, 2008, for example. And the only reason I say 2008 was that was the year that I'd got my autism diagnosis, and it was a year before I finished university. And the first job I ever got was in my local ASDA. And this was an easy job, it just involved, it was a job that had routine, and I didn't realize at that time how much routine mattered to me. um, filling a trolley up full of stock, distributing it on the shop floor, going back up to the warehouse, filling it up again and taking it out again. Very routine, but also very dull, um, a non-stimulative job. So it would lead me to get bored extremely easily. And you would think, having autism, you would crave the routine, you would crave that need for stability. But if you have ADHD as well, you want to break away from that routine. You don't want the routine to always be the same. You want some spontaneity, a little bit of spontaneity in your work. You need that constant stimulation, which you don't always get. And this followed me not only in my work life, but also into my personal life as well. When I was with my first ever partner, who I'd met at university, in a way, we were complete opposites. I was quite reserved, very cautious, not really willing to take risks. I was a yes man essentially. I did as I was told, um, followed the rules, and I think when I was with her, I was probably a different person than to who I am now. Um, I was probably more tolerant back then, and we were complete opposites essentially because I, as I say, was quite introverted. She was extroverted, so she was quite sociable. She had more friends than I did. She liked to go out, have a drink, all that kind of thing, go out clubbing. I didn't really like any of that, you know, or if I did, I'd do it in moderation so that it wouldn't overstimulate me. And at the time, this was something that she didn't fully understand. She knew that I had autism, but she didn't really understand it fully. Um, and I think what didn't help was at the time I'd considered becoming a drama teacher, and her father made it abundantly clear that he did not like teachers. He said, they live very narrow lives and they literally spend their whole time in education and don't really know what the real world is like, which to some extent is true, so he probably saw them as hypocrites in a way. But what I also think was more difficult was the fact that he had an older brother who was a headmaster at a school. And he had, there was him and two or three other brothers. And I think there was competition between them all as to who had the best job, who earned the most money, that kind of thing. So with my partner, it was all about money. This was my partner at the time. And she had finished university a year before I did. So by that time, she could drive a car. She had a full time job. She was earning good money. Essentially, her life had moved forward, and she didn't really have the patience or the resilience to handle my dysregulation. Essentially, when I sometimes I would become dysregulated, I would get upset. She couldn't really understand why I would get upset about things, obsess over things, overthink things, have my interests, and all that kind of thing. So I think sometimes she felt a little rejected, which I had no conscious of at the time, because when we're neurodivergent, we are sometimes lost in our own little world. And sometimes when we have conversations, they feel like multitasking because we're listening, we're thinking, and we're wondering if we've said the right thing. And later on, we're still thinking about it. Did I say the right thing? Does that person like me? I bet they were talking about me behind my back. Well, if they were, I don't care. They're just not my real friends, then, are they? And those kind of sort of knee-jerk responses are typical of neurodivergent people because we don't read people very well. We don't read situations very well. And I found that as a neurodivergent adult, and I'm sure there are other neurodivergent people out there who felt this, we're subject of our environments. Okay? If the environment isn't right for us, socially and mentally, we're going to shut down. You know, I was watching a film with my fiance the other day. A really good film, actually. I highly recommend it. It's currently on Netflix, and it's about the story of a man who has Tourette's, and it's a really, really good film based on a true story. And he basically does the kind of things that I want to do. Be an advocate for people with autism and ADHD, and you know, do talks in hospitals, schools, that kind of thing. And one of the interesting things he says in the film is when you have Tourette's, you build up these, you know, inequities or tics or what have you. And he compared them to the tics being like wanting to sneeze. If you hold in your sneeze long enough, you're going to explode. And I think that's also the case for people with autism and ADHD. And the film is called I Swear. Really, really good film. Probably one of the best films I've watched this year. Um, and it's currently on Netflix. It recently won a BAFTA as well. And it was it was heartwarming for me to see this person advocating for his disability and teaching other people with disabilities that it's okay. Stop apologizing to people. Be you. And that's something I've always struggled with because I do care about what people think of me. I always have done. And that may come from a sense of my biological father not being around, that need to be wanted, that need to be loved, that need to be acknowledged, so to speak, you know. And even now, I still get myself worked up. I still get myself into a rut of, that deep pit of despair, that wanting to escape or not want to do this anymore and move on to something else. It's extremely difficult. And what I've noticed about myself, I can enjoy conversations, but afterwards I do feel it. It's like everything catches up later on. I get so tired and ratty and irritable, and unfortunately, to the behest of my fiance, I may occasionally unintentionally or inadvertently snap at her for little things, or, you know, comment on something that she said that I've not fully interpreted. Well, there's all these different things happening, and because we crave stimulation. And I think when we have a repetitive routine, it can get a bit much sometimes. Not so much if you have autism, but if you have ADHD as well, it is literally the tug of war, you know? Because socially, a conversation to a neurodivergent person is never just a conversation. It's processing, it's thinking, it's managing, it's sometimes replaying it again later on, you know. And looking back, my best friend Tom, whenever we would see each other, we would talk, but we would never really talk. We would never really talk about how we were feeling at that particular point. We would talk about anything other than ourselves, really. Um, we would distract ourselves by watching a film, going for a walk in the park, talking about the girls we can never get, that kind of thing. And the typical sort of friendship conversation. But there is this nuance that men do struggle to talk about their feelings compared to women, you know. And I think really walking in the park on our own was a release in a way from that big social interaction, because apart from the thinking and the listening and the responding, there's also the sensory side of social conversation. You know, you're meeting a group of friends in a pub, and there's other people in the pub, and there's multiple conversations going on. It could be quiz night in the pub, so you've got the guy on the microphone blasting out stuff about a quiz, reading out the questions, and sometimes you can't always understand what they're saying. And you're trying to focus on what your friend is saying whilst being distracted by everything else around you. So, more input means more effort, essentially, guys. And this is what neurodivergent people really struggle with, which is why, as I've got older, I have become less tolerant. And that's not because I don't like people. I don't always particularly trust people, but that's because I don't read them very well. So my defenses are always up. So it takes time for me to let people in. And I feel that needing space after social interaction isn't a sign of weakness. I was always made to think that it was. It's regulation. And I think this was something that I mentioned earlier with my first partner. She didn't understand that I sometimes needed regulation, whereas she wanted to constantly go out, constantly talk, constantly meet people, constantly drink, constantly go out partying. And it was too much for me. It was too much for me. I needed that sense of regulation. Sometimes that need to myself. And people neurotypical or neurodivergent, need to realize that being on your own sometimes is the greatest peace in the world. I'm not saying be on your own constantly, have be it a pet or a hobby or your partner or your friends, but try and sort of limit yourself in order to regulate yourself, because that's what you need to do, folks. That's what, that's what all neurotypical people feel and need to sustain themselves and regulate themselves. So next week we're going to be talking about redesigning systems. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. I'm Dan, the Neuro Man May, and remember, neurodivergence is your superpower.